Dear brothers and sisters, today we're diving deep into a phenomenon that has Western intelligence agencies working overtime, diplomatic circles buzzing with concern, and African youth celebrating across the continent. Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso has become more than just a military leader who took power in September 2022. He has evolved into a symbol of African sovereignty that is sending shockwaves through the corridors of power in Washington, Paris, and Brussels. The question isn't whether Traoré's influence is spreading. The question is why Western intelligence agencies are so terrified of what this spread represents. Today, we'll unpack this phenomenon with the sophistication it deserves, examining the strategic implications, the economic ramifications, and the generational shift that Traoré embodies. We'll explore how his approach to governance, resource management, and regional cooperation is creating a template that other African nations are studying, adapting, and in some cases implementing. To understand the magnitude of Western concern about Traoré's influence, we must first grasp the context from which he emerged. Burkina Faso, under previous leadership, exemplified the neo-colonial template that has dominated Francophone Africa for decades. French military bases dotted the landscape. Uranium and gold flowed to European markets at artificially suppressed prices, and the country's monetary policy remained subordinated to French interests through the CFA franc system. When Traoré and the patriotic movement for safeguard and restoration seized power, they didn't merely execute another military coup. They articulated a comprehensive vision of African sovereignty that resonated far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. Within months, similar movements emerged across the Sahel, each drawing inspiration from Burkina Faso's bold stance against French hegemony. The strategic brilliance of Traoré's approach lies not in its rhetoric, but in its methodical dismantling of neo-colonial structures. Consider the economic dimension. Burkina Faso has systematically reduced its dependence on French commercial networks, diversified its trading partners, and begun processing its raw materials domestically rather than exporting them for value addition in European factories. This isn't revolutionary economics, it's basic economic sovereignty that most independent nations take for granted. Western intelligence reports, leaked through various diplomatic channels, reveal the extent of concern about what analysts are calling the Traoré Effect. These classified assessments don't focus on military threats or security concerns in the traditional sense. Instead, they identify Traoré's influence as an existential challenge to the economic and strategic frameworks that have governed Franco-African relations since the 1960s. The intelligence community's apprehension centers on three critical developments. First, Traoré's success in maintaining popular support while simultaneously challenging French interests has shattered the narrative that African nations must choose between sovereignty and stability. Second, his ability to forge alternative partnerships, particularly with Russia and other non-Western powers, has demonstrated the viability of diversified international relationships. Third, and perhaps most concerning to Western strategists, his youth-centered approach to governance has created a generational template that resonates with Africa's demographic reality. Consider the implications of this last point. Africa's median age is 19 years old. This is a continent where the majority of the population has no living memory of colonialism, limited patience for neo-colonial arrangements, and increasing access to information that challenges Western narratives about African development. Traoré represents this demographic reality in a way that traditional African leadership, often elderly and Western educated, simply cannot. The economic dimensions of Traoré's influence deserve particular attention because they strike at the heart of Western concerns. The traditional model of Franco-African economic relations relied on African countries serving as suppliers of raw materials and consumers of finished goods. This arrangement generated enormous wealth for French corporations while keeping African economies in perpetual underdevelopment. Traoré's economic strategy represents a fundamental challenge to this arrangement. Burkina Faso has begun processing its cotton domestically, developing its mining sector with non-French partners, and implementing agricultural policies designed to achieve food sovereignty rather than export-oriented cash crop production. These aren't radical socialist policies. They're standard development economics practiced by successful emerging economies worldwide. The ripple effects extend far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. When neighboring countries observe Burkina Faso successfully challenging French economic dominance without experiencing the predicted economic collapse, they begin questioning their own subordinated relationships. This demonstration effect is precisely what Western intelligence agencies fear most: the spread of successful examples of African economic sovereignty. Mali and Niger have already begun implementing similar policies with their recent decisions to expel French forces and diversify their international partnerships following the Burkina Faso template. The economic implications are staggering. French corporations face the potential loss of privileged access to resources worth hundreds of billions of dollars annually across Francophone Africa. Perhaps no aspect of Traoré's influence is more significant than its resonance with African youth. This demographic represents not just the numerical majority of Africa's population, but its economic and political future. Unlike previous generations of African leaders who often sought validation from former colonial powers, Traoré's leadership style is unapologetically African-centered. His communication strategy, utilizing social media platforms and direct engagement with citizens, bypasses traditional media gatekeepers who have historically framed African politics through Western perspectives. When Traoré addresses the nation or speaks at international forums, his messages circulate rapidly among young Africans across the continent, creating a sense of shared identity and common purpose that transcends national boundaries. This youth appeal extends beyond charismatic leadership to substantive policy positions that address the concerns of Africa's young population: employment creation through domestic industrialization, educational policies that emphasize African history and achievements, and foreign policies that prioritize African interests resonate powerfully with a generation that has grown up witnessing the limitations of Western-oriented development models. The generational implications are profound. Traditional African leaders, many of whom built their careers within neocolonial frameworks, struggle to connect with populations that view such arrangements as anachronistic and counterproductive. Traoré's success in mobilizing youth support while maintaining national unity creates a template that other young African leaders are studying and adapting. Western intelligence concerns about Traoré's influence extend to regional security arrangements, where his leadership has catalyzed the formation of new cooperative frameworks that exclude Western powers. The alliance of Sahel states, comprising Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, represents more than a military partnership. It constitutes a comprehensive framework for economic, political, and security cooperation that operates independently of French oversight. This regional approach to security challenges the fundamental assumptions underlying Western interventions in Africa. For decades, French and other Western powers justified their military presence in the Sahel by arguing that African nations lacked the capacity for effective self-defense. The success of Sahelian forces in containing security threats through indigenous strategies and regional cooperation undermines this narrative. The security dimension of Traoré's influence extends beyond military cooperation to encompass intelligence sharing, border management, and counter-terrorism operations conducted through African-led initiatives. These developments demonstrate the capacity of African nations to address their security challenges without Western military presence, a realization that has significant implications for French strategic interests in the region. The Western response to Traoré's rising influence has included sophisticated media campaigns designed to discredit his leadership and the broader sovereignty movement he represents. These efforts reflect the recognition that traditional diplomatic and economic pressure may prove insufficient to contain his influence. Western media coverage of Traoré consistently emphasizes military aspects of his rise to power while minimizing the popular support he enjoys and the substantive policies he has implemented. This framing serves to delegitimize his leadership by presenting it as illegitimate military rule rather than acknowledging the democratic deficits of previous governments and the genuine grievances that motivated popular support for change. The media dimension of this struggle reveals the sophisticated nature of contemporary neocolonialism, Unlike the crude propaganda of earlier eras, modern information warfare operates through subtle narrative construction that shapes perceptions without appearing overtly biased. The consistent portrayal of African sovereignty movements as destabilizing, while presenting Western interventions as stabilizing, exemplifies this approach. However, the effectiveness of these media strategies has diminished significantly in the digital age. African youth, who constitute the primary audience for Traoré's message, increasingly consume information through social media platforms and alternative news sources that bypass traditional Western media gatekeepers. This shift in information consumption patterns has reduced the ability of Western powers to control narratives about African politics. The influence of Traoré's leadership extends beyond the Sahel to encompass broader continental dynamics. His emphasis on African unity, resource sovereignty, and independence from neocolonial arrangements resonates with populations across the continent who have witnessed the limitations of post-independence development models. Countries as diverse as Chad, Senegal, and even more distant nations like Kenya and South Africa are experiencing domestic discussions about the viability of alternative approaches to international relations and economic development. These discussions don't necessarily translate into immediate policy changes, but they represent a shift in political consciousness that Western analysts recognize as potentially transformative. The continental dimension of Traoré's influence also encompasses institutional relationships. His government's approach to continental bodies like the African Union and the Economic Community of West African States reflects a commitment to African-led solutions rather than externally imposed frameworks. This position has generated tensions with Western-aligned African leaders, but has also attracted support from populations who view such institutions as insufficiently assertive in defending African interests. One of the most significant aspects of Traoré's influence involves the diversification of international partnerships beyond traditional Western relationships. Burkina Faso's strengthened ties with Russia, China, Turkey, and other non-Western powers demonstrate the viability of alternative international relationships. These partnerships aren't simply anti-Western reactions, but reflect strategic calculations about national interests and development priorities. Russian security cooperation provides alternatives to French military dominance. Chinese investment offers infrastructure development opportunities without the political conditionalities associated with Western aid. Turkish partnerships provide access to technologies and markets that diversify economic relationships. The success of these alternative partnerships undermines Western arguments that African nations have no choice but to accept subordinated relationships with former colonial powers. When other African leaders observe Burkina Faso successfully diversifying its international relationships while maintaining national unity and economic growth, they begin reconsidering their own strategic options. Perhaps the most concerning aspect of Traoré's influence from a Western perspective is its demonstration effect across Africa. Success breeds imitation, and Traoré's ability to challenge Western dominance while maintaining popular support and national stability provides a template that other African leaders can adapt to their specific circumstances. This demonstration effect operates at multiple levels. At the policy level, other nations observe Burkina Faso's resource nationalism, monetary independence initiatives, and diversified partnerships as viable alternatives to neo-colonial arrangements. At the political level, they witness the possibility of maintaining legitimacy while challenging Western interests. At the strategic level, they recognize the potential for African-led security arrangements and regional cooperation. The cumulative impact of these demonstration effects could fundamentally reshape African international relations. If multiple African nations simultaneously reduce their dependence on Western powers while strengthening South-South cooperation, the result would be a geopolitical realignment with global implications. Any honest analysis of Traoré's influence must acknowledge legitimate challenges and criticisms. Military governments, regardless of their popular support or policy effectiveness, raise legitimate concerns about democratic governance and civilian oversight. The sustainability of current policies depends on successful implementation and adaptation to changing circumstances. critics raise valid questions about economic sustainability, arguing that challenging Western relationships without fully developed alternatives could create short-term hardships. They point to the complexity of diversifying economies historically dependent on particular trading relationships and monetary arrangements. However, these criticisms must be evaluated within the context of previous policy failures and the demonstrated limitations of neocolonial development models. The economic stagnation, security deterioration, and political instability that characterized pre-Traoré Burkina Faso suggest that maintaining existing arrangements was neither sustainable nor beneficial for the African people. Western intelligence assessments of Traoré's influence focus not just on current developments, but on projected future trajectories. Analysts recognize that successful examples of African sovereignty create momentum for broader continental transformation. The youth demographics that favor Traoré's approach will constitute an even larger share of African populations in coming decades. The technological dimension of this trajectory deserves attention. Africa's rapid adoption of digital technologies, mobile communications, and internet connectivity creates new possibilities for economic development, political organization, and cultural expression that don't depend on Western gatekeepers. Traoré's leadership has embraced these technological opportunities as tools for sovereignty rather than dependence. Climate change and global economic shifts also favor African agency and self-determination. As traditional Western powers grapple with their own internal challenges, their capacity to maintain neocolonial relationships may diminish. Simultaneously, Africa's growing importance as a demographic and economic center creates new opportunities for independent development. The Western intelligence community's concern about Traoré's spreading influence reflects recognition of a fundamental shift in African political consciousness. This isn't simply about one leader or one country, but about the emergence of a new generation of African leadership that prioritizes African interests, embraces African agency, and refuses to accept the limitations imposed by neocolonial arrangements. Traoré's influence spreads not through military conquest or ideological imposition, but through demonstration and inspiration. Young Africans across the continent observe his leadership and recognize possibilities for their own nations. They see in Burkina Faso's transformation evidence that African sovereignty is not only desirable, but achievable. The economic dimensions of this transformation promise to reshape global relationships. As African nations assert control over their resources, develop domestic processing capabilities, and diversify their international partnerships, they become genuine participants in the global economy rather than merely suppliers of raw materials for others' enrichment. The generational aspects of this change ensure its sustainability. Africa's young population has grown up in an era of global connectivity, technological advancement, and expanded possibilities. They reject the limitations that previous generations accepted and demand leadership that reflects their aspirations for genuine independence and prosperity. Western fears about Traoré's influence ultimately reflect anxiety about African success. The prospect of Africa achieving genuine sovereignty, economic prosperity, and political stability under African leadership challenges fundamental assumptions about global power relationships. This anxiety reveals more about Western insecurities than about African capabilities. The story of Traoré's spreading influence is ultimately the story of African awakening. It represents the emergence of a continental consciousness that recognizes Africa's potential, demands African leadership, and refuses to accept continued subordination to external powers. This awakening has begun, and its trajectory points toward a future where Africa assumes its rightful place as a center of global civilization rather than its periphery. If you found this analysis valuable and want to stay informed about the continuing transformation of African politics, make sure to hit that like button right now. Your engagement helps us reach more people who need to understand these critical developments. Subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell so you never miss our latest insights into African geopolitics and sovereignty movements. Share this video with friends, family, and anyone who needs to understand why African self-determination isn't just a regional issue, but a global transformation that affects everyone. Every like, every share, every comment, helps build the community of people committed to supporting authentic African agency and leadership. The future of Africa depends on Africans having access to accurate information and analysis that respects their intelligence and supports their aspirations. By engaging with this content, you're not just consuming information, you're participating in the broader movement toward African sovereignty and continental unity. Hit subscribe now, and let's continue this journey toward understanding and supporting Africa's rightful emergence as a global power.